Welcome back. Today we're talking about the concept of soil and a lot of the things that are involved with soils and soil systems. Two questions you should be focusing on while we listen today. Why is soil important for living organisms? And secondly, explain different approaches that can be used to conserve healthy soils. As we look at a soil, we really need to think first about what part of the earth we're looking at. So when we talk about the earth, in class we've dealt with three main areas. We have this area up here which we call the atmosphere. We have this interaction here which is the water-based system, and that's usually the hydrosphere. But today we're going to talk about our soils, and we often refer to this as the lithosphere. So in the lithosphere, one of the main things we need to think about is the importance of what soil does in terms of nutrient exchange. One of the very most common ones that a lot of you are familiar with is the carbon cycle. However, in soils, the carbon cycle is a little bit different. If we have, let's say, a tree that is growing in the soil and that tree dies, then the carbon from that tree will slowly go into the soil as that tree breaks down. Same thing if we have maybe an animal that happened to die in this area, the carbon from that animal would also get leached into the soil. That would be our carbon going into our soil. But we also have other things that happen in our soil systems, other types of nutrient exchange. Another one, if we have different rocks on the soil, those rocks will slowly break down over time, and when little bits and pieces of this rock fall off and they get embedded or they go into the soil, so as this rock breaks down, parts of it can go in the soil. Things like phosphorus can start to accumulate into the soil along with other types of elements that we might refer to, things like iron or other types of substances that are made up into the rocks that we look at. And that's usually through natural processes like weathering of the rock. The third thing that we often think about with nutrient exchange actually happens pretty importantly in the soil when we talk about nitrogen. So the last type of nutrient exchange we're going to talk about here is nitrogen. Now in the soil, we have a lot of nitrogen that can just kind of fall onto the soil or get embedded into the soil. And within that soil area, we have little tiny bacteria that live in the soil. And the bacteria living in the soil can help to assimilate some of this nitrogen into the soil. The other thing we have here is we might have certain types of leafy plants. Oftentimes this can be things like beans, and their roots that go into the soil. Along these roots they have little nodules, often referred to as these legumes, and along this space here there can also be more nitrogen fixation going on, and that fixation among the roots of things like bean plants can often help to build up or at least change nitrogen into a more usable form where it gets into the plants, or it can help fix different types of nutrients. Then, when we look at the different types of soil, we often focus on the basics, these three types of soil that can make up this fourth type of soil that we call loam. So sand, silt, and clay are the types of soil, and different mixtures of those can make what we call loam. If we talk about the overall structure, basically what I'm referring to is the size of these different particles. So sand particles are often bigger particles. Silt particles are often a bit smaller than sand. And then clay particles are very, very tiny particles. And the structure of these particles is what makes these other things different in these different types of soil. And loam, of course, as I said, is like a combination of these different types of things. So we've got sand, silt, and clay, and a mixture of those is what we call loam. So we've got all three types in this loam. So in terms of water infiltration, sand is a very good filter of water. Water can pass through this very easily. The second thing is silt, and silt is okay at filtering water. It can get in, but not quite as much, and we'll talk about why in a second. Clay is actually very bad at taking in water. The water cannot easily penetrate here because even as I drew this, there's many, many more clay particles, and we'll talk about why the water doesn't get in here, but often will run off quicker than it can filter in. And then loam is also pretty good at taking in water. It can hold some, but not quite as, it doesn't filter in quite as well as sand. The water holding ability, now if you poured a bunch of water into a cup of sand, it would not hold the water very well at all. The water would just rush right through there and it wouldn't be able to hold it. Silt, on the other hand, if it had time to take in the water, same thing. Silt can hold some water, but not quite as good as clay. Now, if the water has enough time to seep into the clay, it can hold a lot of water in all these tiny little spaces in between here. And again, loam is okay at holding water. It can get in there and actually be held pretty well. Nutrient holding is kind of a different story, but it's very much the same as water holding. So the ability to hold the nutrient is almost as good as the ability to hold water. So sand, not good with nutrients. Silt is okay with nutrients. Clay, if it's got the nutrients in there, is really good at holding them. And again, loam is kind of an ideal one for holding nutrients. Sand has a pretty good amount of air spaces. Silt is okay with air spaces. Clay, not so good with airspace, and loam has kind of a nice mix. So if you were looking for the ideal type of soil, we really want to look for a good combination of these things here. And if I had to pick a type of soil that I wanted to use maybe on a farm or in a garden, loam would often be the #1 choice of a good soil because it's got a decent ability to filter water, hold nutrients, and air spaces in particular. That's the places where the roots can grow easily, and if they can't grow into the soil, like in clay or even kind of in silt, if they can't grow in there with the appropriate amount of water and nutrients, you're not going to have a very healthy system. So the final part we want to talk about is soil degradation and conservation. Usually when farmers come across land like this, they often have to go through a process of deforestation, or possibly slash and burn or something in order to clear this amount of land. Once farmers get into this, you can see there's lots of ways that they're going to possibly degrade the soil, although there are ways that they can work against it. The basic one you see in the picture here, we have plowing going on. You can also call this tilling in the soil, and that's going to simply turn the soil over and kind of expose it up to the top. Farmers also have a lot of times they will pump in water into the soil, and they'll use this for irrigation. And also they will a lot of times add fertilizer to the soil, specifically things like phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium. Now, if we look at this, a lot of these processes are necessary in order to get our food supply, but they do lead in the huge potential for a lot of soil degradation. For example, behind the plow here, you can see a lot of this soil being blown away by the wind, and possibly the water can take it away as well through a natural process that we call erosion. And when the soil gets blown away, that could lead to leaving this, if we blow away a lot of that topsoil, a lot of this could lead to something called desertification. Now, desertification is basically what it sounds like, where a desert is possibly formed because all these lighter particles get blown away, especially things like clay and silt that we had learned about before. Additionally, if we irrigate a lot, a couple of things can happen. These key nutrients that are really important for plant growth, they can get leached away, and in the process of this leaching, the plants won't be able to grow because of these important nutrients are away. Another huge cause, though, if we over-irrigate, when we bring in the water is often full of minerals. And these minerals, if they build up in the soil due to irrigation, it can lead to something that we call salinization. And if the salinization happens, it's basically building up the salt in the soil, and that's also a pretty bad situation for plants that aren't able to grow because of the imbalance of salts to the ability to uptake water. Basically, if we talk about soil conservation, then changing any of these effects or changing any of these acts would be a huge way to prevent soil loss. So if we don't cut down forests, if we reduce the amount of tilling and plowing, if we avoid things that cause erosion, if we leave plants intact, we're going to possibly conserve the soil. And if we monitor how we fertilize an area and how we irrigate an area and where we irrigate, we can really lead to a lot of soil conservation. So I hope you learned something new today. Hope to see you back here again real soon.